The champagne tasted like battery acid. Reese stood in the shadows of the grand hall watching the man he'd bled for slide a platinum ring onto someone else's finger. 10 years of surviving back alley pack wars. 10 years of stitching Alexander's knife wounds in cheap motels. And now Alexander was crowning Caspian as his Luna beneath crystal chandeliers. Reese didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just turned his back on the applause, let the mating mark on his neck throb, and walked away. The Northridge Syndicate did not do things quietly. When they celebrated, they rented out the entire top floor of the Grand Hotel, draping the walls in white orchids and paying off the city police to ignore the heavy SUVs idling on the curbs downstairs. Reese hated orchids. They smelled like funerals. He stood near a massive marble pillar, a half-empty glass of sparkling water warming in his grip. The suit he wore was tailored charcoal gray, expensive enough to buy a small car. Alexander had bought it for him last week. "Wear this," Alexander had said, his voice heavy with that familiar commanding alpha timbre that usually made the base of Reese's spine tingle. "Just stand near the back. I need to know you're there. I need you to understand why I'm doing this." Reese understood perfectly. He just hadn't expected it to feel like taking a crowbar to the ribs. At the center of the room, on a raised dais, stood Alexander. He looked every inch the apex predator he was born to be. Broad shoulders filling out a bespoke tuxedo, dark hair, slicked-back jaw, set in a hard, uncompromising line. He was the newly minted Alpha of the Syndicate, a title he had won through 3 years of brutal, unglamorous street warfare. Warfare that Reese had fought right beside him, but standing next to Alexander now wasn't Reese. It was Caspian. Caspian was everything Reese was not. Caspian was 22, unblemished, and born into the high society echelon of the Western Pacts. He had golden hair that caught the chandelier light and skin that had never felt the rough concrete of a parking lot brawl. Caspian smelled of vanilla expensive pheromone suppressants and generational wealth. Reese smelled like petrichor old leather and the faint coppery tang of the scar tissue running down his left side, a parting gift from an assassin who had tried to gut Alexander 3 years ago. Reese had taken the blade instead. "Do you, Alexander Reed, take Caspian to be your bound Luna, to share your territory, your name, and your protection?" the officiant asked. The microphone echoed through the cavernous room. The crowd of 400 wolves was dead silent. Every politician, every capo, every old money aristocrat leaned in. Reese looked at Alexander. For a fraction of a second, the Alpha's eyes flicked over the heads of the crowd. He was looking for the pillar. He was looking for Reese. When their eyes met, Alexander's golden irises flashed a silent plea. "It's just politics," that look said. "It's an alliance. We need the western borders. You know I only love you." Reese held the gaze. He felt the phantom weight of Alexander's hands on his skin. Remembered the way Alexander used to bury his face in Reese's neck on the cold nights when they had nothing but a space heater and half a pack of stale cigarettes. "I love you," Alexander had whispered in the dark 100 times over. But love didn't secure shipping routes. Love didn't merge corporate assets. Alexander looked away, turning his attention back to the golden boy beside him. "I do," Alexander said. The words were a physical blow. Reese actually felt his lungs stutter. The mating gland on the side of his neck, the one Alexander had bit into, claiming him unofficially years ago, the one that bound their nervous systems together in a messy, imperfect knot, flared with sudden blinding heat. It was the biological reality of an alpha formally tethering his soul to another. The feral ancient part of Alexander's wolf was making room for Caspian, and to do that, it was aggressively shoving Reese out. Reese swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He set the glass of water down on a passing waiter's tray. The crowd erupted into applause. Caspian threw his arms around Alexander's neck, leaning up to capture his mouth in a practiced, camera-ready kiss. Flashbulbs went off. The new king and his perfect queen. No one noticed the scarred Omega slipping out the side door. Reese walked down the carpeted hallway. His dress shoes made no sound. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom muffled the cheering behind him, reducing the sound to a dull rhythmic thudding like a failing heartbeat. He didn't wait for the elevator. He hit the heavy metal push bar of the stairwell and started the long descent to the ground floor. With every flight of stairs, the bond tying him to Alexander frayed a little more. It was a localized agony, a sharp pulling sensation behind his sternum. Omegas were biologically wired to cling to their alphas. The modern world liked to pretend they had evolved past it, masking their primal instincts with stock portfolios and luxury cars. But biology was a ruthless bastard. Reese's body was screaming at him to go back to submit to fight the interloper, to bare his throat and beg for scraps of Alexander's attention. Reese gripped the metal handrail, his knuckles turning white. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing his breathing to slow. "No," he whispered to the empty stairwell. The word was rough-scraped raw from the back of his throat. He was 30 years old. He had killed men. He had starved. He had built a criminal empire from the dirt up with his bare hands just to hand the keys to a man who decided he needed a prettier hood ornament. He was not going to beg. Reese reached the ground floor. He pushed out into the alley behind the hotel. The crisp night air hit him, smelling of exhaust fumes and impending rain. He pulled his phone from his pocket. There were 3 messages from Alexander sent an hour before the ceremony began. Dom. "You're here, right? Dom Reese, answer me. Dom, I'll come find you after the press photos. Wait in my suite. I have the vintage scotch you like." Reese stared at the glowing screen. He highlighted the conversation thread. He hit delete. Then he dropped the phone onto the wet asphalt and brought the heel of his shoe down on it, crushing the glass and the motherboard into a spiderweb of useless junk. He kicked the debris into a nearby storm drain. He had a 2-hour head start before the reception ended. It was time to become a ghost. Alexander's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a high-rise overlooking the city's financial district. It was a masterpiece of cold modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling glass brushed steel, dark mahogany. It was designed to intimidate. Reese keyed his way in for the last time. The silence of the apartment felt heavy. It usually smelled of Alexander cedar ozone and the sharp metallic tang of alpha dominance. Today, it just smelled empty. Reese didn't turn on the lights. He navigated the sprawling living room by the ambient glow of the city skyline outside the windows. He walked directly to the master bedroom. He pulled a faded canvas duffel bag from the back of the walk-in closet. It was the same bag he'd owned when he first met Alexander 10 years ago. Back then, it had held everything Reese owned. Tonight, it would serve the exact same purpose. He bypassed the rows of designer suits Alexander had purchased for him. He ignored the silk shirts, the cashmere sweaters, the imported Italian leather shoes. He opened a lower drawer and pulled out 3 pairs of well-worn denim jeans, a handful of plain cotton t-shirts, and a heavy scuffed leather jacket. From the bedside table, he took his forged passport, a leftover contingency plan from the gang war days. He took the emergency stash of untraceable cash they kept hidden behind a false panel in the wall. 50,000 in tight rubber-banded stacks of hundreds. Alexander wouldn't even notice it was gone. To the Alpha, 50 grand was a rounding error. To Reese, it was a new life. He walked into the master bathroom. The bright vanity lights flickered on harsh and unforgiving. Reese gripped the edges of the marble sink and stared at his reflection. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his pale eyes. His hair was slightly disheveled from the humid night air, but it was the mark on his neck that held his attention. Just above his collarbone, the bite mark sat angry and inflamed. It wasn't a fully healed perfect crescent because Alexander had never officially bonded him. It was a raw, jagged claiming mark that Alexander refreshed every few months to keep other alphas at bay. But now, with Alexander's wolf officially tethered to Caspian, the bond was aggressively rejecting Reese. The skin around the bite was a bruised, sickly purple. Reese opened the medicine cabinet. He pushed aside Alexander's expensive aftershaves and pulled out a small, unlabeled brown glass bottle. Black market suppressants. The heavy-duty kind that made you violently ill, but completely masked an Omega's scent and forcibly severed the lingering psychic threads of a broken bond. He dry swallowed 3 of the bitter pills. Almost immediately his stomach cramped. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He gripped the sink harder as the room tilted. The suppressants were toxic, essentially chemically burning out his pheromone receptors. But they worked. By the time he reached the city limits, he wouldn't smell like Alexander's Omega. He wouldn't smell like anything at all. He splashed cold water on his face, grabbed a towel, and wiped his mouth. One last thing. Reese walked into the massive chef's kitchen. He stood by the kitchen island, a slab of black granite, where he and Alexander used to drink coffee in the quiet hours of the morning before the rest of the world woke up. Before the syndicate, before the money, before the political marriages, Reese reached to his left hand. On his index finger sat a plain silver band. It was scratched and tarnished. Alexander had won it in a poker game in a dingy basement 8 years ago and tossed it to Reese across a sticky table. "Keep that safe for me," Dom had said, flashing a bloody grin. Reese had worn it every day since. He slid the ring off his finger. The metal felt warm from his body heat. He placed it dead center on the black granite. It looked incredibly small in the vast, expensive kitchen. He didn't leave a note. Notes were for arguments. Notes were an invitation for a conversation. Reese had nothing left to say. Alexander had made his choice in front of 400 witnesses. Reese hoisted the canvas bag onto his shoulder. The suppressants were kicking into high gear, making his vision blur slightly, but his mind was crystal clear. He walked out the front door, locking it behind him. The rain started just as he emerged from the lobby of the building. It fell in heavy, cold sheets, washing the grime from the sidewalks. Reese pulled the collar of his leather jacket up against the chill. He walked 3 blocks to a subway station, paying cash for a ticket to the Central Transit Hub. From there, he would take a commuter rail to the edge of the state, then buy a used car with cash and drive until the ocean stopped him. He sat on the hard plastic seat of the subway car, watching the dark tunnels blur past the windows. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks was the only sound. He was no longer the shadow behind the throne. He was just a man on a train fading into the dark. The reception was a suffocating success. Alexander Reed stood at the head table, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, projecting the aura of a man who owned the world. And tonight, he largely did. The alliance with the Western Pack was sealed. His father's old rivals had spent the last 3 hours bowing their heads in deference. Caspian was sitting beside him, laughing at a joke a senator had just told, looking flawless. But beneath the tailored tuxedo, Alexander's skin was crawling. His inner wolf was pacing restlessly, agitated and snapping. The crowning ritual had been intense, a flood of new pheromones and foreign psychic weight. Caspian's presence in his mind was bright, loud, and demanding. But it lacked the deep grounding anchor that Alexander had relied on for a decade. Alexander checked his phone for the 20th time. Still nothing. Usually at these excruciating high society events, Reese would be leaning against a wall in the periphery, catching Alexander's eye and giving him a barely perceptible eye roll. Later, they would go back to the penthouse strip off the stifling suits, and Reese would pour them both a drink, while casually dissecting the weaknesses of everyone they had spoken to. Reese was his strategist, his confidant, his spine. He's just pissed, Alexander told himself, taking a sharp swallow of the bourbon. He has a right to be. I'll make it up to him. Alexander had rationalized this marriage for months. He had explained it to Reese late at night. It's just a piece of paper. It's for the territory. Caspian gets the title, but you get me. Nothing changes between us. Reese had listened quietly, his face an unreadable mask, and nodded once. Alexander had taken that nod as submission. He had taken it as acceptance. Alexander, darling, Caspian purred, placing a manicured hand on Alexander's forearm. The vanilla scent spiked cloying and sweet. The photographer wants a few more shots of us by the ice sculpture before they start cutting the cake. Alexander forced a smile. He gently removed Caspian's hand. Give me 10 minutes. I need to make a quick phone call to the European handlers. Time zones. Before Caspian could pout, Alexander stepped off the dais and melted into the crowd. He moved with a predatory grace, sidestepping the sycophants and well-wishers, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the ballroom. He checked the shadows by the marble pillars. Empty. He checked the coat check. Empty. He checked the balcony. Just a couple of drunk junior executives smoking cigars. A low growl vibrated in Alexander's chest. The agitation was upgrading to a low-grade panic. He pushed through the heavy oak doors and marched down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators. He pulled out his phone and dialed Reese's number. The number you have dialed is unallocated or currently powered off. Alexander stopped walking. He stared at the phone. Unallocated. That was a burner phone protocol. Why would Reese burn his phone? He's just throwing a tantrum, Alexander muttered aloud, though the words tasted like ash. Reese didn't throw tantrums. Reese was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly practical. If Reese was unreachable, it was deliberate. Alexander didn't go back to the ballroom. He bypassed the VIP elevator and took the service lift down to the underground garage. He tossed his valet ticket to a startled attendant, grabbed the keys to his Aston Martin, and tore out of the garage, the tires squealing against the concrete. The drive to the penthouse took 12 minutes. Alexander didn't remember stopping at a single red light. He practically tore the front door off its hinges when he reached the apartment. Reese! He barked his alpha command, lacing his voice designed to force an omega to present themselves. The command echoed through the cavernous living room and died. The apartment was pitch black. The air was stale. Alexander flipped on the lights. He strode through the living room, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hard wood. Reese, stop playing games. I don't have time for this tonight. He pushed open the bedroom door. The bed was made. perfect, untouched hospital corners. He checked the bathroom. The harsh vanity lights were off. Alexander's breathing grew shallow. He was an apex predator attuned to scent and environment. And his environment was telling him something impossible. The lingering scent of petrichor and old leather Reese's scent was fading. It wasn't just old. It was chemically masked. He walked into the closet. His eyes immediately went to the bottom drawer. It was cracked open, empty. The worn denim, the old shirts, gone. He looked at the shelf where Reese kept the canvas duffel bag. Empty. No, Alexander whispered. The words sounded thin, pathetic. He backed out of the closet and walked toward the kitchen, his mind desperately trying to assemble a narrative that didn't end with him losing the only thing he actually cared about. He turned the corner into the kitchen and froze. The overhead pendant lights illuminated the black granite island. Sitting dead center, illuminated like a museum exhibit, was the tarnished silver ring. Alexander walked toward it slowly, as if it were an explosive device. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. It was cold. It had been off Reese's skin for hours. The realization hit Alexander with the force of a freight train. The air left his lungs in a violent rush. His knees buckled, and he caught himself against the edge of the granite counter, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the stone. Reese hadn't thrown a fit. Reese hadn't demanded a larger allowance or a better apartment across town to keep as a mistress. Reese had looked at the empire they built, looked at the man he loved, and decided it wasn't worth the price of admission anymore. A sharp, agonizing tear ripped through Alexander's chest. The bond. The incomplete, messy 10-year-old bond he had neglected. He reached up, clutching his own chest, a raw, animalistic sound tearing from his throat. The agonizing emptiness crashed down on him. He had crowned his Luna tonight. But standing in his multi-million-dollar penthouse, clutching a cheap silver ring, the alpha of the Northridge Syndicate, realized he was entirely, utterly alone. Cape Monroe was a place where people went to be forgotten. It was a miserable stretch of jagged coastline, 3 states away, perpetually choked by freezing fog and the smell of dead fish. The town consisted of rusted canneries, a few dive bars with neon signs that constantly flickered, and a boatyard that repaired the battered commercial fishing vessels limping in from the Pacific. Reese worked at the boatyard. He went by the name Dean. It had been 8 weeks since the wedding. 8 weeks of waking up at 4 a.m. to vomit bile into a cracked porcelain toilet. The black market suppressants were doing exactly what they promised. They had flatlined his pheromones and severed the psychic screaming of his broken bond. But they were tearing his liver apart in the process. He had dropped 15 pounds. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by heavy canvas coveralls stained with diesel grease. He lay on his back, on a mechanic's creeper, sliding under the hull of a 40-foot trawler. Rain drummed a relentless, deafening beat against the tin roof of the dry dock. He gripped a heavy torque wrench, his scarred hands straining as he tightened the bolts on the propeller shaft. "Hey, Dean." Reese didn't flinch. He just stopped pulling on the wrench and let his eyes drift to the heavy boots standing next to the creeper. It was Miller, the grizzled beta, who owned the yard. Reese slid out from under the boat, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of a rag. "Yeah, take your break. You'll look like a corpse." Miller grunted, tossing a thermos of black coffee onto a nearby oil drum. "Engine's not going anywhere. The captain can't pay the docking fees anyway." Reese stood up. His knees popped and a wave of dizziness washed over him. He grabbed the edge of the hull to steady himself. The world tilted sideways for a fraction of a second before righting itself. Miller frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. You need a doctor, kid. That cough you've got sounds like a diesel engine dry heaving. And you're shaking. I'm fine, Reese lied smoothly. His voice was rougher than it used to be scraped raw by the constant nausea. Just didn't sleep well. He unscrewed the thermos and took a swallow. The coffee was scalding and bitter, but it grounded him. He walked over to the large open bay doors of the warehouse and looked out at the churning gray ocean. This was his reality now. There were no million-dollar deals. There were no midnight drives in European sports cars. There was just the cold, the grease, and the dull, persistent ache behind his sternum, where Alexander used to reside in his mind. Sometimes, usually in the dead of night, his treacherous biology would try to reach out. The frayed edges of his inner wolf would grope blindly in the dark, searching for the heavy, suffocating warmth of its alpha. When it found nothing but the chemical void of the suppressants, the panic would set in. Reese would lie on the lumpy mattress of his rented motel room, digging his nails into his own palms until they bled, riding out the phantom withdrawal. He pulled a small brown glass bottle from the chest pocket of his coveralls. 2 pills left. He tipped one into his palm. It looked harmless. A tiny, chalky cylinder. He dry swallowed it, wincing as the bitter taste coated the back of his throat. He had to find a street doctor soon to get a refill, or the mask would drop. If the mask dropped, the suppressants would leave his system, his natural scent would return, and he would light up like a flare to any alpha within a 10-mile radius. Worse, the psychic tether to Alexander might reestablish, and Reese would rather swallow glass than let Alexander feel him again. He wiped his mouth, turned his back to the ocean, and slid back under the boat. The cold metal of the wrench was a comfort. It was real. It was tangible. It didn't make promises it couldn't keep. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Northridge Syndicate headquarters was dead silent. The air was thick enough to choke on. Alexander Reed sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. He looked pristine. His suit was flawlessly tailored, his tie perfectly knotted, his jaw freshly shaven. But his eyes were terrifying. They were sunken, ringed with dark exhaustion, and the golden irises of his wolf bled through the human brown, unstable, and predatory. 7 of his top capos sat rigidly in their chairs, none of them daring to breathe too loudly. "Explain it to me again," Alexander said softly. His voice was a low, vibrating hum that made the hair on the back of the men's necks stand up. A heavy-set alpha named Costa cleared his throat, sweat beading on his forehead. The shipment at the docks, boss. The union reps walked out. They're demanding the retroactive hazard pay we negotiated last quarter. The cargo is sitting on the tarmac rotting. Alexander stared unblinkingly at Costa. Who negotiated that pay? Costa swallowed hard. "Reese did, sir." The name dropped into the room like a live grenade. 3 men flinched. Alexander's jaw muscles feathered. The mention of the name sent a physical spike of agony through his chest. It had been 2 months. 2 months of ripping the city apart block by block, interrogating every contact, leaning on every politician. Nothing. Reese had vanished with the efficiency of a seasoned ghost. What Alexander was slowly, painfully realizing was how much of the empire Reese had been quietly holding together. Alexander was the muscle. He was the terror that kept the rival packs in line. But Reese was the architect. He remembered the birthdays of the police commissioners' wives. He structured the laundering fronts. He negotiated with the unions. Without him, the bureaucratic machinery of the syndicate was grinding to a catastrophic halt. "Fix it," Alexander whispered. "Sir, they want to sit down. They won't talk to me." They said they only deal with... Alexander's hand slammed flat on the table. The heavy mahogany cracked down the center, a jagged fissure splintering under the sheer brutal force of an alpha's raw strength. I said fix it! Alexander roared, his control snapping. The alpha pheromones flooded the room, heavy with rage and ozone, forcing the capos to lower their heads in involuntary submission. Do not come back here until those crates are moving. Get out! The men scrambled for the door, practically tripping over each other to escape the suffocating pressure of Alexander's aura. Alexander remained standing, his chest heaving. He braced his hands on the ruined table, hanging his head. The silence in the boardroom rushed back and ringing in his ears. The double doors clicked open again. Alexander, are you all right? I could hear you shouting from the reception area. It was Caspian. The young Luna stepped into the room, wearing a designer trench coat, carrying a paper cup of artisanal coffee. The heavy scent of vanilla rolled off him, artificially bright and aggressively cheerful. It was meant to be soothing. To Alexander's frayed nerves, it smelled like cheap air freshener in a slaughterhouse. I'm working, Caspian. Alexander gritted out, not looking up. Caspian sighed, walking closer and trailing a manicured hand along the edge of the broken table. You're always working. You missed the charity gala last night. The photographers were asking where my husband was. It was humiliating. Alexander finally looked up. He stared at the beautiful, flawless boy he had married. Caspian was exactly what the syndicate needed on paper. But standing in the wreckage of his own making, Alexander felt nothing but a cold, heavy apathy. He felt no protective urge. He felt no pull in his chest. His wolf recognized Caspian as a packmate and ally, but entirely rejected him as a mate. I had a supply chain crisis, Alexander said flatly. Caspian pouted, stepping into Alexander's personal space. He placed a hand on Alexander's chest, trying to release a targeted wave of calming pheromones. You need to relax. Come home. We can open that vintage champagne. Alexander stepped backward, physically breaking the contact. His inner wolf snarled at the foreign touch. Don't! Caspian's face fell, the perfectly practiced smile cracking. Why are you treating me like this? We are bonded. I am your Luna. You have the title. Alexander said, his voice dropping into a deadly emotionless register. You have the credit cards. You have the protection. Do not push for things I cannot give you. Caspian's eyes welled with tears. It's him, isn't it? You're still tearing the state apart, looking for that scarred-up stray. He left you, Alexander. He abandoned the pack. Alexander crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion. He didn't touch Caspian, but he boxed him in against the wall, towering over him. The air pressure in the room plummeted. Do not ever! Alexander breathed, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. Speak about him again. Caspian trembled, shrinking against the drywall, wholly overpowered by the apex predator in front of him. Alexander held the stare for 3 agonizing seconds before turning on his heel and walking out the private exit to his office. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a secure line. He answered it on the second ring. Boss, came the gravelly voice of Gideon, his lead tracker. We got a hit. Alexander stopped dead in the middle of his office. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. Where? Facial recognition scrubbed from an ATM camera near a Greyhound station. It's 2 months old. He took a bus west. But that's not the main thing. I tapped our contacts in the underground medical circuits. Somebody's been trying to buy grade 9 neurosuppressants in bulk up the coastline. The kind used to artificially flatline an omega bond. Alexander closed his eyes. The breath hitched in his throat. The idea of Reese pumping that poison into his veins just to sever their connection made him physically sick. "Trace the buyer," Alexander ordered. "Find him." Reese miscalculated. He had stretched the last pill for 3 days, cutting it into fragments with a razor blade. He thought he could endure the slow bleed of the withdrawal until the local smuggler he had contacted dropped off the new supply at the docks. He was wrong. It was a Friday night. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy freezing mist hanging over Cape Monroe. Reese was walking back to his motel, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his leather jacket. The first warning sign was the heat. It started at the base of his neck, a sudden searing spike of temperature radiating from the mutilated claiming mark. He stumbled, catching himself against a rusted chain-link fence. Then came the scent. Without the chemical barricade, his biology violently rebounded. The scent of petrichor and old leather flooded the damp alleyway. But it wasn't the crisp, sharp scent of a healthy omega. It was laced with the sour, metallic tang of distress and a broken bond. It smelled like blood in the water. "Fuck," Reese wheezed. He pushed off the fence, forcing his heavy legs to move faster. The motel was 2 blocks away. Just 2 blocks. He didn't make it past the first corner. A heavy shape stepped out from the doorway of a closed pawn shop blocking his path. It was Trent, one of the forklift operators from the boatyard. Trent was an alpha. A low-level, unbonded alpha who usually reeked of cheap beer and unwashed clothes. Tonight, his eyes were blown-wide pupils dilated as they locked onto Reese. "Dean!" Trent's voice was thick, practically slurring, as the raw, unmasked Omega pheromones hit him. "Christ, you're an Omega. Why do you smell like you're dying?" "Back off, Trent," Reese said, his voice deadly calm, despite the violent trembling in his limbs. He squared his shoulders, shifting his weight onto the balls of his feet. He was sick. He was exhausted, but he had survived 10 years in the syndicate. Trent took a step forward, his alpha instincts overriding whatever meager common sense he possessed. A distressed, unbonded Omega in a dark alley. It was a biological trigger for the worst kind of violence. "You need help? You're sick. Let me take you back to my place. I can take care of you." Trent reached out his thick, calloused hand, aiming for Reese's shoulder. Reese didn't retreat. He stepped inside the man's guard. With blinding speed, Reese's left hand shot up, deflecting Trent's arm outward. In the same motion, his right hand formed a rigid strike, the heel of his palm slamming brutally into the soft cartilage of Trent's throat. Trent choked, his eyes bulging as his airway was crushed. He stumbled backward, gasping for air. Most people would run. Reese didn't. He followed the momentum. He grabbed Trent's extended arm, twisted his hips, and brought his elbow down with sickening force exactly on the joint. The snap of bone echoed sharply in the damp alley. Trent hit the wet concrete, screaming in agony, clutching his shattered arm. Reese stood over him, chest heaving. His vision was swimming with black spots. The exertion had pushed his already failing body over the edge. The heat from his neck was radiating into his skull, causing a blinding migraine. "I'm not a stray," Reese whispered to the writhing man, coughing as the metallic taste of blood filled his own mouth. He turned and practically dragged himself down the last block to his motel. He fumbled with the cheap brass key, kicked the door shut behind him, and threw the deadbolt. He barely made it to the bathroom before his knees gave out. He collapsed onto the cold linoleum, violently dry heaving into the toilet, until there was nothing left but a thin string of bloody saliva. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. The suppressants were completely gone. The agonizing tug of the broken bond tore through his chest, demanding he seek out his alpha. He curled into a tight ball on the floor, clamping his hands over his ears as if he could block out the biological screaming in his own blood. Alexander, his inner wolf, whined a pathetic, desperate sound in the empty room. "No!" Reese sobbed quietly, his voice cracking in the dark. "No!" He lay there on the cold floor, letting the fever consume him until he finally passed out. 2 hours later, the local clinic logged an emergency admit. A dock worker named Trent had stumbled into the ER with a shattered radial bone and a crushed larynx. When the exhausted, overworked nurse asked what had happened, Trent, high on morphine, mumbled about a sick Omega at the boatyard who fought like a cartel hitman. The nurse typed the report into the statewide medical database. It was standard protocol for assault cases. 300 miles away in a dimly lit server room beneath the Northridge Syndicate headquarters, an automated keyword algorithm pinged. Gideon, staring at a bank of monitors, watched the alert flash red on his screen. The keywords matched the profile parameters he had set Omega. Unregistered. Advanced combat proficiency. Coastal location. He picked up his phone and hit speed dial. Alexander answered instantly. "Tell me." "Cape Monroe," Gideon said. "A fishing town on the edge of the state line. A local alpha just got his arm snapped in 3 places by an Omega matching Reese's description. The locals said the Omega was heavily distressed, scenting like a broken bond." Alexander didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was chillingly calm, a dead giveaway of absolute unhinged focus. "Ma, fuel the helicopter," Alexander said. "Send a ground team to secure the perimeter of the town. No one leaves. No one gets on a boat. No one gets on a bus. Boss, it's a civilian town. If we roll in heavy, I don't care if you have to buy the local police department or burn it to the ground." Alexander interrupted his alpha tone, crushing the line. "I am going to get my mate." The sleek black twin-engine helicopter tore through the coastal fog, its rotors beating the heavy air into submission. Below, the town of Cape Monroe looked like a graveyard of rusted ships and rotting wood. Alexander Reed sat in the back of the chopper, staring down at the bleak landscape. He was fully suited in black tactical gear, the heavy Kevlar vest a stark contrast to the tailored tuxedos he had worn for the past 2 months. Opposite him sat Gideon and 4 of the Syndicate's most lethal enforcers. None of them spoke. The interior of the cabin was suffocating heavy with the oppressive, suffocating weight of Alexander's unleashed alpha pheromones. He was a hair's breadth away from going completely feral. "We've locked down the perimeter," Gideon said through the headset intercom. Local law enforcement accepted a $50,000 donation to the police pension fund. They've recalled all cruisers to the station. The town is ours for the next 6 hours. "Take us down," Alexander ordered. The helicopter touched down on a cracked asphalt parking lot near the docks. The rain was driving in sideways, freezing and bitter. Alexander dropped from the cabin before the skids fully settled, his boots hitting the wet ground with a heavy thud. "Boss!" Gideon jogged to keep up as Alexander strode directly toward the neon red sign of the local medical clinic. "The tracker says the motel is 3 blocks east. I need a scent profile first." Alexander set his voice a low mechanical growl. "I need to know exactly what I'm walking into." He kicked open the glass double doors of the clinic. The receptionist, an older beta woman reading a paperback, dropped her book in terror as 5 heavily armed men flooded the tiny waiting room. Alexander ignored her. He followed the sharp, pungent scent of fear and antiseptic down the narrow hallway. Pushing open the curtain to Trauma Bay 1, Trent lay on the gurney. His right arm was locked in a temporary splint, heavily wrapped in gauze. His neck was braced. He was pale and sweating, but the moment Alexander stepped into the room, Trent scrambled backward, a pathetic whimper tearing from his throat. Even heavily medicated, the low-level alpha recognized an apex predator. Alexander stepped up to the edge of the bed. He didn't yell. He simply leaned down, bracing his gloved hands on the metal rails. "You touch my Omega," Alexander whispered. Trent's eyes rolled wildly. He couldn't speak through the crushed larynx, but he shook his head violently, tears spilling down his cheeks. He raised his good hand in a universal gesture of surrender. Alexander closed his eyes and inhaled. Beneath the smell of iodine and Trent's pathetic terror, he found it. The ghost of Reese's scent transferred onto Trent's jacket. Petrichor and leather. But it was mutilated. It smelled sour, laced with the chemical rot of heavy suppressants and the agonizing metallic tang of a severed bond. It was the scent of an Omega actively dying from biological rejection. A jagged tremor ran through Alexander's hands. He opened his eyes, the irises burning a brilliant, unnatural gold. "Room 14. Seaview Inn." Trent managed to croak out, terrified Alexander was about to finish the job Reese had started. Alexander turned his back on the bed and walked out into the rain. The Seaview Inn was a dilapidated two-story strip of peeling paint and flickering exterior lights. Room 14 was on the ground floor facing a rusted chain-link fence. Gideon gestured for the enforcers to stack up by the door, reaching for the heavy breaching ram strapped to his back. "No," Alexander said. He stepped up to the cheap wooden door. He didn't bother checking the handle. He simply raised his boot and drove it with piledriver force directly adjacent to the deadbolt. The door frame splintered instantly, the heavy brass lock tearing through the cheap wood. The door flew open, slamming against the interior drywall. Alexander stepped inside. The air in the room was stagnant, smelling of mold-stale sweat and blood. The bed was unmade sheets, tangled. On the cheap laminate nightstand sat an empty brown glass bottle. "Reese!" Alexander's voice cracked. He moved toward the bathroom, the only other room in the cramped space. The door was ajar. Alexander pushed it open. His heart stopped. It didn't stutter. It physically seized in his chest. Reese was curled on the cold linoleum floor, wedged between the toilet and the bathtub. He was wearing stained canvas coveralls. He was terrifyingly thin, his cheekbones sharp and hollowed out. His skin was the color of old parchment damp, with a sickly freezing sweat. His lips were cracked and stained with dried blood, but the worst part was his neck. The claiming mark Alexander had placed there years ago was a ruined, blackened mass of necrotizing tissue. Reese's body, forcibly deprived of its alpha and chemically suppressed, was quite literally eating itself alive to purge the connection. "Out!" Alexander barked to Gideon, who was standing in the doorway. "Get the medivac prepped. Now!" Alexander dropped to his knees on the filthy floor. He stripped off his tactical gloves with his teeth, needing skin-to-skin contact. He reached out his hands, trembling violently, and pulled Reese's limp body into his lap. Reese weighed nothing. The solid, lethal enforcer Alexander had fought back-to-back with for a decade felt as fragile as hollow glass. "Reese! Hey! Hey, I'm here!" Alexander buried his face in Reese's neck, deliberately pressing his scent glands against the ruined skin, flooding the tiny bathroom with a tidal wave of pure, heavy alpha pheromones, cedar ozone, and desperate, frantic protection. Reese didn't wake, but his body reacted. A violent shudder ripped through his spine. He gasped a wet rattling sound, and his hands instinctively clawed at Alexander's Kevlar vest. his fingers curling into the fabric with a death grip. His biology recognized the anchor it had been starving for. Alexander wrapped his arms tightly around Reese, burying his face in the dirty dark hair. For the first time since he was a child, bleeding in the gutters of the city, the Alpha of the Northridge Syndicate began to cry. "I've got you," Alexander choked out, lifting Reese into his arms and standing up. "I'm taking you home. I've got you." The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator was the first thing Reese registered. He didn't open his eyes immediately. He took inventory of his body. He was lying on a mattress that was too firm, covered in sheets that smelled of industrial bleach. The crushing, agonizing pain in his chest had receded to a dull, throbbing ache. There was a dull pinch in his right forearm, an IV drip. And then he felt the air. It was heavy, suffocating. It pressed against his skin like a physical weight. The scent of cedar and ozone was so thick, it practically coated the back of his throat. Reese opened his eyes. He was in a sterile white room, a private medical suite. Through a wall of reinforced glass, he could see the distant, glittering skyline of the city. He was back in Syndicate territory. Sitting in a leather armchair beside the bed was Alexander. The Alpha looked awful. He was out of the tactical gear, wearing a wrinkled white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had a dark shadow of stubble along his jawline, and his eyes were bloodshot, tracking Reese's every micro-movement with terrifying intensity. "Don't move," Alexander said, his voice a ragged rasp. "Dr. Hayes said your liver enzymes are critical. You've been unconscious for 3 days." Reese stared at the ceiling. He felt no surge of relief. He felt no romantic swelling of the heart. He just felt an exhausting, bone-deep weariness. He had fought so hard to disappear, and now he was right back in the cage. Without a word, Reese reached over with his left hand, gripped the plastic hub of the IV needle embedded in his right arm, and ripped it out. A stream of blood immediately tracked down his forearm, staining the pristine white sheets. Alexander was out of the chair in a fraction of a second. He slammed his hand down over the bleeding puncture wound, applying brutal pressure. His eyes flashed gold. "What the fuck are you doing?" "I don't belong here," Reese said. His voice was incredibly weak, raspy from the intubation tube they must have used, but it was dead steady. He didn't try to fight Alexander's grip. He just looked at him with hollow, empty eyes. "You almost died on the floor of a cheap motel." Alexander yelled, his composure fracturing. "Another 12 hours and your nervous system would have collapsed. Why would you take that black market garbage? You could have come to me. You could have asked for a severance." "A severance?" Reese let out a short, broken laugh that turned into a wet cough. He tasted copper. "Like I was an employee. Like I was a mid-level accountant. You caught stealing from the till." "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean." "Dom," Reese whispered, turning his head to look directly at the Alpha. "You stood on a stage and married a 22-year-old aristocrat because you wanted the shipping lanes. You wanted the western border. You wanted everything. And you thought I would just sit in the penthouse like a good little stray and wait for you to come home when you were bored of playing king." Alexander flinched. The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He eased the pressure on Reese's arm, grabbing a sterile gauze pad from the bedside table and taping it over the wound. His hands were shaking. "I did it for us," Alexander said desperately. "The Western Pacts were mobilizing. If I didn't marry Caspian, they would have blockaded the ports. It was a strategic alliance. It meant nothing. I left the reception the moment I realized you were gone. I've spent the last 2 months tearing this state apart looking for you." "Did you consummate the bond?" Reese asked. The question hung in the sterile air, cold and sharp. Alexander froze. "Reese, did you consummate the bond, Alexander?" Reese repeated, his tone devoid of any emotion. It was an interrogation. "No," Alexander breathed. "I swear to God, I haven't touched him. I haven't even slept in the same room as him. My wolf rejects him. It's always been you." Reese closed his eyes. "It doesn't matter. You tied your wolf to his, in front of 400 witnesses. The pack recognized it. My biology recognized it. You pushed me out. You don't get to pull me back in just because you feel guilty." Alexander backed away from the bed. He paced the length of the room, running a hand through his dark hair, looking like a caged animal. "The syndicate is falling apart." Alexander admitted the confession tasting like poison. "Costa can't handle the unions. Gideon can't balance the books. I've had to execute 2 lieutenants in the last month just to keep the lower ranks from mutinying. I'm a butcher, Reese, I know that. I've always been the butcher. But you were the architect. You built this empire. I just guard the walls." Reese opened his eyes, staring blankly at the glass wall. "Then let it burn. It's not my problem anymore." Alexander stopped pacing. He stared at the bruised, broken man in the hospital bed. Reese wasn't throwing a tantrum. Reese had truly fundamentally let go. The realization terrified Alexander more than losing his territory, more than dying in a street war. Alexander reached into his pocket. He pulled out the tarnished silver ring. He had carried it every single day since he found it on the kitchen island. He walked slowly back to the bed. He set the ring on the edge of the mattress right next to Reese's hand. "I'm not putting that back on," Reese said softly. "I know," Alexander said. Then Alexander did something that defied every law of nature, every instinct hardwired into the genetic code of his species. He dropped to his knees on the sterile tile floor. He didn't just kneel. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable curve of his neck, the carotid artery pulsing just beneath the skin. It was the ultimate absolute posture of submission. An apex alpha, the ruler of the Northridge Syndicate, baring his throat to a broken, unbonded omega. Reese's breath hitched. His eyes widened slightly. "Dom, stop. Get up." "I was a coward," Alexander said, his voice vibrating against the floor. "I took the easy political route because I thought you would always be there to absorb the damage. I used your loyalty as a shield. I broke our bond for a piece of paper." Reese stared at the bowed head of the man he loved. His chest tightened painfully, a war between his deeply ingrained survival instinct and the bruised, battered remains of his heart. "Get up," Reese demanded, his voice cracking. "I'm not asking you to put the ring back on." Alexander continued, refusing to move. "I'm not asking you to be my Luna. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you not to disappear again. Let me fix this. Let me tear it all down and build it the right way." Reese looked at the silver ring resting on the white sheet. It looked heavy. It looked like a shackle. It looked like home. "Caspian is your legally bonded mate," Reese said bitterly. "You can't just walk away from that without triggering a war with the West." Alexander slowly raised his head. His golden eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely ruthless. It was the look of a man who had already made peace with total annihilation. "I know," Alexander said softly. The video call was encrypted, routed through 3 different offshore servers to prevent tracing. Alexander sat behind the massive oak desk in his private study at the penthouse. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, his posture rigid and commanding. The fatigue was still visible around his eyes, but the frantic desperation was gone. In its place was cold, diamond-hard resolve. On the large monitor across from him were 3 faces, the elders of the Western Pack. And sitting slightly behind them, looking pale and furious, was Caspian. Alexander, the lead elder, a scarred alpha named Vance, growled. "You've ignored our summons for a week. Your borders have been closed. Our shipping containers are rotting in your ports. And now you demand a parley over a screen." "I'm not here to negotiate," Alexander said. His voice was flat, devoid of any diplomatic warmth. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy cream-colored document bearing the wax seals of both packs. The mating contract. Caspian leaned forward, his hands gripping the back of the elder's chair. "Alexander, what is going on? Why won't you let me into the penthouse? The guards told me I'm locked out of the syndicate accounts." Alexander didn't look at Caspian. He kept his eyes locked on the elders. 2 months ago, I entered into this alliance under the pretense that it would solidify our borders and bring prosperity to both our territories. "Which it has," the elder snapped. "But the cost was unacceptable." Alexander continued smoothly. "I made a fundamental error in judgment. I attempted to substitute a political arrangement for a true mate bond. My inner wolf rejects the boy. I cannot and will not fulfill the biological obligations of this union." The elders erupted in outrage. "You arrogant bastard!" Vance roared, slamming his fist on his desk. "You swore an oath before 400 witnesses. You claimed our bloodline. You cannot simply annul a pack mating because you got cold feet." "I am not annulling it," Alexander said quietly. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy silver lighter. He flipped the lid open with a sharp clack. "I am terminating it." Alexander brought the flame to the corner of the thick parchment. The dry paper caught instantly the fire racing up the edges, turning the intricate calligraphy into black ash. The silence on the video call was deafening. Caspian let out a choked, horrified gasp, covering his mouth with his hands. To burn a mating contract while the ink was barely dry was not just an insult, it was an act of explicit, unforgivable war. Alexander held the burning document over an expensive crystal ashtray, dropping it only when the flames licked at his fingertips. He watched the embers die out. "The Northridge Syndicate claims no alliance with the West," Alexander said, looking back up at the monitor. "Caspian will be safely escorted back to your borders by nightfall. The ports are closed to your ships. If your soldiers cross the river, they will be killed. Consider this our final diplomatic correspondence." He hit the kill switch before they could respond. The screen went black. The silence in the study was heavy. Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. He had just alienated half the state. He had just guaranteed a bloody, protracted turf war that would cost millions of dollars and likely dozens of lives. He had set his empire on fire. The heavy oak door of the study clicked open. Alexander opened his eyes. Reese stood in the doorway. He was still pale, and he leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane, his body still recovering from the brutal toll of the suppressants. He wore soft gray sweatpants and an oversized black sweater that swallowed his thin frame. It was one of Alexander's sweaters. Reese looked at the smoking ashes in the crystal tray. He had heard the entire conversation through the cracked door. "You burned it," Reese said. His voice was quiet, analytical. "I did," Alexander replied, not moving from his chair. They're going to retaliate. Vance will mobilize the Western enforcers within 48 hours. They'll hit the supply lines first. Try to choke us out financially." "I know." Reese stepped fully into the room, leaning his weight on the cane. He walked over to the desk, staring down at Alexander. "Costa isn't smart enough to handle a two-front war. He'll deploy the muscle too thin. You need to fortify the eastern docks and let the West burn themselves out trying to cross the bridges." Alexander looked up at Reese. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Are you telling me how to run my war?" "I'm telling you how to not get yourself killed." Reese countered, his pale eyes flashing with a fraction of their old sharp fire. "Because if you die, I have to deal with Gideon, and I hate Gideon." Alexander stood up slowly. He rounded the desk, stopping 2 feet away from Reese. He didn't dare cross the boundary without permission. "Reese," Alexander whispered. Reese let out a long, shuddering breath. He dropped the cane. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He reached out and grabbed the lapels of Alexander's suit jacket, gripping the expensive fabric tightly. "If you ever," Reese said, his voice vibrating with a fierce, possessive anger, "if you ever pull a stunt like that again, if you ever think you can replace me with a prettier pawn, I won't just leave. I will put a bullet in your head myself. Do you understand me?" Alexander reached up, wrapping his large hands gently around Reese's wrists. "I understand. I swear to you, Reese. I understand." Reese pulled the Alpha down, crushing their mouths together. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was desperate, angry, and violent. It was the collision of 2 apex predators who had almost destroyed each other. Reese tasted like iron and bitter medicine. Alexander tasted like smoke and expensive bourbon. Alexander wrapped his arms around Reese's waist, lifting him off his feet, terrified that if he let go, the Omega would vanish into thin air again. Reese tilted his head back, exposing his neck. The scarred, ruined tissue of the old bite mark was fully exposed. Alexander didn't hesitate. His eyes bled into solid gold. He buried his face in the crook of Reese's neck, his canines extending. He bit down hard right over the scarred tissue, claiming him. Not with a temporary mark meant to keep other wolves away, but with a deep, permanent soul tether. The bond snapped into place with the force of a lightning strike. Reese gasped, arching his back, as the agonizing emptiness in his chest was instantly violently filled with the heavy protective weight of his Alpha. The psychic link flared to life, bright and searing, intertwining their nervous systems, until there was no clear division between where Reese ended and Alexander began. Alexander slowly pulled back, licking the drop of blood from the fresh wound. He rested his forehead against Reese, both of them, breathing heavily. "Mine," Alexander growled softly. "Yours," Reese affirmed, his eyes fluttering shut as he finally let his weight settle fully against the Alpha. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver ring. He took Reese's left hand and slid the metal over the index finger. It fit perfectly. "We have a war to fight tomorrow," Alexander murmured, brushing a thumb over Reese's hollow cheek. Reese opened his eyes, looking toward the dark window toward the city that was about to erupt in violence. The ghost of a smirk played on his scarred lips. "Then let them come. We fought from the gutter before. We can do it again. The crown meant nothing. The king meant everything." Alexander burned his political alliances, shattered a treaty, and invited a massive pack war just to prove he wouldn't rule a single street without Reese by his side. It's not a fairy tale. It's going to be bloody brutal, and they have an entire empire to defend. But the true Luna is finally back where he belongs. What did you think of Alexander's ultimate submission? Was burning the contract, the right move? Or did he just doom the syndicate? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you loved this gritty, angst-filled Omegaverse journey, make sure to smash that like button. Share this with your fellow BL lovers and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next dark romance story. See you in the next one.